the serial killers who recorded their victims, the disturbing story of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. The detective pressed play. The television flickered softly in the dim room. On the screen sat a woman. Her hands were tied. Her voice trembled. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for a way out. Behind the camera, a calm male voice began speaking. The voice belonged to Leonard Lake. And what investigators were watching were the final moments of someone's life. But the most disturbing part was this. The camera had been placed there on purpose. Lake and his partner, Charles Ng, had recorded their victims, not by accident, but as trophies. And when police eventually uncovered the truth, it revealed one of the most horrifying serial killer cases in American history. Because hidden deep in the forests of California, Lake and Ng had created something straight out of a nightmare. A secret bunker, a prison for their victims, and a place where their twisted fantasies became reality. Long before the crimes began, Leonard Lake was already drifting into a dangerous mental world. He had been born in San Francisco in 1945. From the outside, he seemed intelligent and creative. He enjoyed photography and writing, and many people who met him initially thought he was simply quiet or introverted. But the truth was far more troubling. Lake struggled deeply with relationships and control. He became obsessed with survivalism, the belief that modern society could collapse at any moment. Many people during the Cold War had similar fears, but Lake's thoughts went much further. He began writing detailed journals describing a future after civilization had fallen. In his vision, the world was controlled by small groups of men who had survived the collapse. Women, however, would not live freely in this new world. Instead, they would be captured and kept as prisoners. Lake even gave this fantasy a name. He called it Operation Miranda. In these writings, women would be forced to live inside underground bunkers, serving their captors without any hope of escape. To most people, these writings would have seemed like disturbing fiction. But for Leonard Lake, they were something else entirely. They were a plan. And soon he would meet someone willing to help him carry it out. That person was Charles Ng. Ng had grown up in Hong Kong before moving to the United States as a young man. His early life was troubled. He struggled with discipline and quickly found himself involved in crime. He was caught stealing. Later, he was arrested for weapons offenses while serving in the United States Marine Corps. By the time he met Leonard Lake in the early 1980s, Ng was already used to living outside the law. But what brought the two men together wasn't just crime. It was their shared fascination with domination and violence. The two quickly bonded. They spent long hours discussing survivalism, weapons, and violent fantasies about controlling others. For Lake, it must have felt like he had finally found someone who understood him. Someone who shared his darkest ideas. Soon, the pair decided to create a place where they could live out those ideas. They purchased property deep in the wooded hills near Wilseyville, California. To anyone passing by, the land looked ordinary, just another quiet rural property surrounded by trees. But hidden on that land, Lake and Ng were building something terrifying. A bunker. From the outside, the structure appeared to be a simple wooden shed, but inside, investigators would later discover a small, hidden room. Concrete walls, a bed, restraints, and a camera. This was the place where Lake planned to bring his fantasy to life. Except there was one problem with his plan. The world had not ended. Society had not collapsed. But Leonard Lake was tired of waiting. So instead of waiting for the apocalypse, he decided to start early. The victims came from many different backgrounds. Some were acquaintances who trusted the men. Others were people who simply crossed their path at the wrong moment. Couples sometimes disappeared after visiting the property. In other cases, entire families vanished without explanation. Investigators later believed that Lake and Ng would lure victims to the cabin. Once there, they were quickly overpowered. The male victims were usually killed first. Then the women were taken to the bunker. And this was where the cameras came out. Because Lake wanted to record what happened. He treated the recordings almost like documentation, as if he were filming a twisted experiment. On the tapes, Lake often spoke calmly to the women. He explained rules. He told them what would happen if they resisted. The women on the recordings were terrified. Many begged for their lives, but the camera never turned away. Detectives who later reviewed the footage described it as some of the most disturbing evidence they had ever seen. Even experienced investigators struggled to watch the tapes. Some officers reportedly refused to view them more than once. But at the time the crimes were happening, no one knew. The killings continued in secret, hidden deep in the forest, and they might have continued for much longer, if not for one small mistake. In June of 1985, Leonard Lake walked into a hardware store. He attempted to steal a vise. It was a small, ordinary theft, but an employee noticed what he was doing and contacted the police. When officers arrived, Lake was arrested outside the store. At first, it seemed like a simple shoplifting case, but when police searched his car, they discovered something suspicious. There were illegal weapons and multiple identification documents that did not belong to him. Lake was taken into custody, but what the officers didn't know was that Lake had prepared for exactly this situation. Hidden in his clothing was a cyanide capsule. Shortly after his arrest, Lake swallowed it. Within minutes, he began to convulse. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. Days later, Leonard Lake died, and at that moment, investigators had no idea how important that small arrest would become. Because once police began digging deeper into Lake's life, they were led to the property in the woods, the property near Wilseyville. And what they found there would shock even seasoned detectives. As officers searched the land, they began discovering disturbing signs: burned patches of earth, scattered personal belongings. Then they found bones, human bones. More searches uncovered buried remains across the property, fragments of skulls, pieces of clothing, personal items that once belonged to missing people. But the most disturbing discovery came from inside the cabin. Investigators found videotapes, dozens of them, each one labeled carefully. When detectives played the tapes, they realized they were watching the crimes themselves, recorded, documented, preserved. But there was one major problem. Charles Ng was gone. As soon as the investigation began, Ng had fled. Authorities launched an international search. Months later, Ng was arrested in Calgary, Canada, after being caught shoplifting from a store. The irony was chilling. Just like Leonard Lake, Ng had been caught committing a small theft. But behind that small crime was a trail of unimaginable violence. Ng fought extradition for years before finally being returned to California. His trial became one of the longest and most expensive in the state's history. Prosecutors presented the evidence: the bunker, the journals describing Operation Miranda, and the videotapes. Ng claimed that Leonard Lake had been the mastermind, that he himself had simply been manipulated. But the jury did not believe his story. They saw the evidence, and eventually they delivered their verdict. Charles Ng was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. Even today, investigators believe the true number of victims may never be known. Some estimates suggest that as many as 25 people may have died at the hands of Lake and Ng. Many of them were never identified. Their families never learned what happened to them. And the tapes? Most remain sealed as evidence, too disturbing to ever be released publicly. But perhaps the most chilling part of this story comes from Leonard Lake's own writings. Years before the murders began, he wrote that he wanted to build a world where he had total control over others. For a terrifying period of time, hidden in the woods of California, he managed to do exactly that. And the only reason the nightmare ended was because a serial killer decided to steal a tool from a hardware store.